In a noisy world obsessed with talking, one quiet observer discovers a strange psychology truth. Silence doesn't make people invisible. It makes everyone else reveal themselves. A room was full of voices. Warm yellow lights hung from the ceiling, softly lighting the long wooden table in the center. Outside the large windows, evening clouds slowly moved across the darkening sky. A light rain tapped gently against the glass. Inside the room, people were talking all at once. Some spoke loudly. Some interrupted each other. Some laughed a little too hard at their own jokes. The air felt busy and crowded, even though there was still space between the chairs. At the far end of the table sat someone who barely spoke. The quiet observer. Their chair was slightly turned toward the window. From there, they could see everything: the table, the people, the shifting expressions on each face. While everyone else spoke, the quiet observer simply listened. A cup of warm tea rested in their hands. The steam rose slowly into the air. Across the table, two people were arguing about something small. Their voices grew louder as they tried to prove their points. Another person leaned forward quickly, cutting them off. No, that's not what happened," they said. More voices joined. Soon, 5 people were talking at the same time. The quiet observer watched. Not the words, but the behavior. One person kept tapping their fingers nervously against the table. Another laughed whenever they felt uncomfortable. Someone else nodded too quickly, as if trying to appear confident. These small details were everywhere, but no one seemed to notice them, except the quiet observer. Many people believed silence meant something simple. They thought quiet people were shy, or nervous, or unsure. Sometimes people even assumed quiet meant weak. The quiet observer had heard these ideas many times before. Long ago, those opinions used to feel heavy. Back then, silence felt like standing in the corner of a crowded room while everyone else moved freely. Words seemed like tickets that allowed people to belong. But over time, something slowly changed. The quiet observer began to notice something strange. When people talked constantly, they rarely listened. They rushed their thoughts. They filled every pause. They feared silence. And because they feared silence, they often revealed more about themselves than they realized. Across the room, someone suddenly turned toward the quiet observer. "You're so quiet," they said with a small laugh. A few others looked over. "Yeah," another voice joined. "You haven't said anything all evening." The quiet observer offered a small, calm smile. They did not rush to respond. For a moment, the table grew slightly quieter. Not completely silent, but softer. People waited. And in that small pause, something interesting happened. The person who had asked the question began speaking again. "Well, you must be thinking something, right?" A nervous chuckle followed. Others looked curious now. The quiet observer gently placed the teacup on the table. Their eyes moved slowly around the room. Still, they did not speak, and the silence stretched just a little longer. For some people, silence feels uncomfortable. It creates space, and inside that space, people begin hearing their own thoughts more clearly. Soon, someone else filled the quiet. "I guess they just like listening," another voice said. "Yes," someone added. "Some people are just observers." The conversation slowly returned. But something subtle had changed. Several people began speaking more carefully. Some looked slightly thoughtful. It was as if the quiet observer had placed a mirror in the middle of the table, without saying a single word. Later in the evening, the rain outside became stronger. Soft drops turned into a steady rhythm against the windows. Inside, the light seemed warmer now. Most of the group had relaxed, but the conversations still moved quickly. Stories overlapped. Opinions bounced across the table. The quiet observer continued watching the small details. Someone bragged about a recent success. But their smile faded quickly when no one reacted strongly enough. Another person told a story that became slightly exaggerated each time they repeated it. A third person nodded constantly while secretly checking their phone under the table. Words filled the room, but beneath the words, emotions quietly moved like slow currents in deep water. The quiet observer noticed something important. When people spoke endlessly, they were often trying to control how others saw them. They wanted to appear confident, interesting, important. Words were tools, but silence worked differently. Silence did not try to prove anything. It simply existed. And because it existed, it made space for truth. At one moment, a discussion began about success. "What do you think success really means?" someone asked. The question traveled around the table. Each person answered quickly. "Money," one said. "Freedom," said another. "Recognition," a third added. The answers came fast, almost like people were racing. Finally, someone looked toward the quiet observer again. "What about you?" they asked. The room grew still. Outside, thunder rumbled quietly in the distance. For a moment, the quiet observer looked toward the rain-covered window. Lights from passing cars blurred across the glass. Inside the room, every eye waited. But the quiet observer did something unexpected. They simply leaned back slightly in their chair and remained silent. No words, just calm presence. The silence lasted longer this time. 5 seconds, then 10. People shifted slightly in their seats. Some smiled awkwardly. Others looked down at the table. And then something fascinating began to happen. Instead of waiting for an answer, people started thinking. Real thinking. Not fast responses. Not rehearsed opinions. One person slowly said, "Maybe success is different for everyone." Another voice added more softly, "Yeah. Maybe it's just feeling peaceful." Someone else nodded slowly. The conversation became quieter now, more thoughtful, less competitive. Without speaking, the quiet observer had changed the entire rhythm of the room. And most people did not even realize it. Silence had created space. And inside that space, people began hearing themselves more honestly. The quiet observer lifted the teacup again. The tea had grown slightly cooler. Outside, the rain softened once more. The room no longer felt crowded with noise. Instead, it felt slower, calmer, more real. And in that calm atmosphere, the quiet observer understood something deeply important. Silence was never emptiness. Silence was influence. But this realization was only the beginning. Because very soon, the quiet observer would discover just how powerful silence could truly become. The room stayed calm after that moment. The conversation had slowed, but not in an uncomfortable way. It felt different now, softer, more thoughtful. People spoke one at a time instead of competing for attention. Outside the window, the rain had become lighter again. Small drops slid slowly down the glass, reflecting the warm lights inside the room. The quiet observer noticed something new. Earlier, everyone had been trying to speak more. Now people were beginning to listen more. One person leaned back in their chair, staring thoughtfully at the table. Another slowly stirred their drink, as if lost in their own thoughts. No one rushed to dominate the conversation anymore. Silence had changed something. A few minutes later, someone across the table suddenly laughed softly. "You know what's funny?" they said. Everyone looked up. "We talk so much, but when things get quiet like this, I actually start thinking about what I'm saying." A few people nodded. Another voice joined. "Yeah, usually conversations feel like a race. Everyone just trying to respond faster." The quiet observer listened. Still calm, still present. Their silence was no longer strange to the group. Instead, It had become something steady, like a quiet anchor in the room. Someone looked toward them again. "But you," the person said slowly. "You've been quiet the whole time." The room waited. This time, the quiet observer gently leaned forward. Their expression remained calm, thoughtful. For a moment, it seemed like they might finally speak. But again, they paused. And that pause felt powerful. Not awkward, not empty, just peaceful. And then something surprising happened. The person who asked the question began answering it themselves. "I guess. Maybe silence makes people think more." Another person added, "Maybe we avoid silence because it forces us to face our own thoughts." A soft realization began spreading through the room. The quiet observer noticed the shift clearly. Earlier, the energy had been loud and restless. Now it felt reflective, slower, more honest. Someone near the center of the table suddenly spoke again, but this time their voice was much quieter. "You know, when things are silent, I actually notice how I feel." A few heads turned. They continued. "When everyone talks nonstop, I just react. But when things slow down, I start understanding my own mind." The quiet observer gently nodded. Just once. It was a small gesture, but it carried meaning. The rain outside had almost stopped now. Clouds slowly drifted away, revealing a faint silver moon behind them. Inside the room, the lights reflected softly across the wooden table. For a while, no one spoke, and strangely, no one rushed to break the silence either. The group had discovered something unexpected. Silence was not something to escape. It was something that revealed truth. Finally, someone smiled and looked toward the quiet observer again. "I think I get it now," they said. The quiet observer raised their eyes slightly. The person continued, "When you stay quiet, it makes everyone else show who they really are." The room went still, because deep down, everyone realized it was true. Throughout the evening, the quiet observer had learned so much about each person without asking a single question. Confidence, insecurity, excitement, doubt. All of it had appeared naturally, not because someone forced it out, but because silence created space for it to surface. One person slowly shook their head with a small smile. "That's kind of powerful," they admitted. Another added quietly, "Yeah, maybe the quietest person understands the most." For the first time that evening, the quiet observer finally spoke. Their voice was calm and gentle. Not loud, not dramatic, just simple. "Sometimes," they said softly, "people only hear others." The room leaned in slightly. But silence helps people hear themselves. No one interrupted. No one rushed to reply. Because the words felt complete. The quiet observer leaned back again, returning to their calm presence. The group remained thoughtful for several moments. Outside the window, the rain had completely stopped now. Streetlights reflected on the wet road, shining softly in the night. Inside the room, the atmosphere felt different from when the evening began. Earlier, the space had been filled with noise. Now it felt filled with awareness. People began speaking again eventually. But their tone had changed. They paused more. They listened more. They thought before responding. And every so often, the room would return to silence. But this time, the silence felt comfortable, even meaningful. The quiet observer lifted their teacup again, noticing it had gone cold. They smiled slightly, not because they had controlled the room, but because they had witnessed something beautiful. People discovering the power of their own minds. The evening slowly came to an end. Chairs moved back. Coats were picked up. Soft goodbyes were exchanged. As people walked toward the door, several of them glanced back toward the quiet observer. Their expressions were different now. Not curious, not confused, respectful, because they had learned something simple yet powerful. The loudest voice does not always shape a room. Sometimes, the quietest presence does. The quiet observer remained seated for a moment longer, looking out at the calm night beyond the window. In a world that constantly tells people to speak louder, prove more, and fill every moment with noise, silence had revealed a deeper truth. The mind grows clearer when words slow down. Understanding appears when space is created. And sometimes, the most powerful message is the one that is never spoken. If this story made you reflect on the power of silence, gently tap like and carry this quiet wisdom into your own conversations. Because the next time a moment of silence appears, you might discover something your mind has been trying to tell you all along.